State programs and state interventions pervert the feedback mechanisms that exist on the free market. Of the two, interventions are far more damaging than just state programs. If a king taxed his subjects at 10% in terms of resources, which could be money, whatever, just 10% of value, and spent that money on a bunch of crap that benefited nobody but the king, but beyond that let his subjects be, his subjects would still have 90% functionality in their productive life. That is, things would be produced with 90% of people's resources according to what people were willing to buy with the remaining 90% of their resources. The first things to go, if this tax were enacted de novo, would typically be luxury goods. Think Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In hard times, people sell their jewelry for food, not food for jewelry. So the 90% economy wouldn't just have less value floating around, but the production would be structured differently. This is why third world countries don't have really tiny cars and really tiny houses and each person just eats really tiny McDonald's meals. They have no cars, shacks for shelters, rags for clothes, and very plain foods with little meat that is typically needs to be heavily spiced to prevent a gag reflex. Production is structured differently based on the resources they have. A state program is similar to the king's tax. Resources are siphoned off from the population and some worthless program is created. And worthless may be hyperbolic, but it is by definition worth less than what those resources would have been used had they not been taxed away. We know this because those programs were not spent on it in the free market. That's why it had to be a state program in the first place. Examples of state programs are state education camps called public education or transfer payments to poor people. These things do pervert the structure of production to some extent, but their main cost is the direct taxation, which includes 12 years, the time taxation spent in those education camps. A state program of any type is disconnected from the demands of the emergent order to some extent. It is like an organ that doesn't fully feel pain, or a company that doesn't suffer from its misallocation of resources. Because if the state education camps had to rely on voluntary enrollment and voluntary payment of tuition, ignoring the destitute for now, they would not receive enough funds to sustain their operation. That is, they would be sensitized to the fact that they're wasting a titanic amount of resources. Now, I know that if all state education camps were privatized and all legal standards requiring an appropriate education, whatever that means, were removed, there would be a lot of people voluntarily paying to send their kids to some formally stated education camps than if those camps had never existed in the first place. Habits develop and are not broken precipitously. The reason state programs are not totally dysfunctional is because they are not totally unregulated by demand. There are ways to pester and harass the education camps and get them to conform to the demands of the people. And if the state is based on the fantasy that voting equals the law, democracy, a politician may cite the dysfunction of the camps as a reason to vote for him to reform the camps. I'm definitely not endorsing votingism, but there is some feedback in votingism. That is, the education camps are not completely desensitized, but they must be desensitized enough in order to exist in the first place. However, the resource misallocation is occurring, and the desensitization allows for much more misallocation in the same way desensitization to heat allows a person to keep pressing his hand on a hot stove. But as shitty as state programs are, they are not nearly as awful as interventions. State programs, while always having some negative interventionist impact on the economy, are predominantly just taxing, just siphoning off resources. Interventions can destroy the market itself, and what's worse is that the effects of interventions tend to be blamed on the free market.